Hello and welcome to this review of my Cooler Master MasterKeys Pro M. As the Cooler Master logo on the thumbnail indicates, this is a sponsored video like the Matthias one I did a while ago. As with that video, I informed Cooler Master that I'd still give it an honest review and say what I genuinely think of it, pointing out flaws if I find them. Anyway, I requested this one for review because I thought it's a particularly interesting model which partially harks back to the older keyboards I usually review. I found out about it at the UK meetup in February where someone brought its predecessor, the Quickfire TK, and I decided to ask CM for one. But CM didn't stock that model anymore, so they sent me this updated model instead, and I've been using it for the customary week to review. Now I'll just kick off with it. The biggest reason why I find this so interesting is because of the layout, which is ironically one of the things they promote the least on its product page. Nowadays, a lot of people, especially gamers, tend to go for TKL or tenkeyless layouts, which basically means that the Numpad or 10 key has been lopped off. This frees up space for the mouse so you can move it around more freely, basically, but I've always found it a nuisance because I really like the Numpad and I use it a lot. Therefore, I always much preferred the idea of the older XT and AT layouts, which were also space-saving in a way, but instead of the Numpad, they lacked the nav cluster, which is the thing in the middle with the arrow keys and the navigation buttons, because by this time it hadn't been invented yet. So this is what I refer to as a navless layout, a layout without a nav. The key here is that you still retain the functionality of both the nav cluster as well as the numpad, because you can toggle between them with the numlock key. Ever since the Model M, there's been a separate nav cluster on most, and nowadays basically all keyboards, so there's no reason to toggle between them on the numpad, and the numlock key became largely useless. Most people don't even know what it does. Until I saw this one, where they did basically exactly that. CM essentially took a clue from the 80s and put out this navless model, and more often than not, doing a keyboard like it was done in the 80s is a smart move. So you get a space-saving package, but you still keep the functionalities of both the nav cluster as well as the numpad. Nice! Of course you'll have to get used to toggling between them with the numlock key, but this isn't as hard or doesn't take as much time as you'd think. My advice is to do two things. First of all, keep the keyboard on nav mode by default, and then when you enter a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just train yourself to start and end it with numlock like so. That way it's easier to work with it in a natural way. Second, I'd switch on toggle keys, which is somewhere in the ease of access center somewhere. This makes the computer beep every time you press a lock key. And it makes it easier to track what mode it's in because the lock lights are on top of rather than next to each other and therefore kind of useless. Now what I find so cool is that Cooler Master didn't just copy this idea from the 80s, they also improved it. Normally, the biggest problem of using the numpad as a nav cluster is that the layout of the buttons is very different from how it is on a separate nav cluster. The arrow keys are in a cross shape rather than the standard inverted T, and the nav buttons are in the corners and at the bottom rather than on this bank here, and the orientation is very different. Normally, for example, insert is on the top left, but on the numpad that's the home key instead. Northgate actually put a layout like that on its OmniKey Ultra keyboard, and the resulting nav cluster is much less convenient to use than a standard T-nav. Instead, CM put all these functions in the same shape as you're used to, a T-nav at the bottom and 2 rows of 3 keys on top of that. This is much more user-friendly, but by necessity there are 2 things that complicate matters slightly. First of all, to get a T-nav, the 0 key had to be chopped into 2 separate keys, and so they added a 00 button. If you're used to a big 0 button, it's a bit harder to hit, and I think they could have put something more useful here than a 00, like a comma or a backspace, or even just another 0 to prevent mistakes. Second, and this is something you can only find out through testing, the shape feels different. With a T-nav, it's relatively easy to locate the buttons based on feel alone, because of all the corners. With this, those corners aren't there because it's just one block, so the arrow keys don't stand out as much. The way I fix this is to program the lighting, which we'll get to in a bit, in such a way that only the arrow keys light up. I also highlight the delete key as I use that one a lot, and if you rest your index finger on it, the rest of the nav buttons are pretty easy to find anyway. One thing you can't do on this board, but which would be even better, is that the keyboard would toggle between different lighting modes when you press num lock, so it would highlight all the keys in num mode and only the arrow and nav buttons in nav mode. The 1 and 3 keys don't do anything in this mode anyway. Moving on to the other features and starting with the lighting, it's got white-only backlighting, which you can customize in several ways. It doesn't need external software to program them, which I really like because the programs that some of the other keyboards use are nothing short of horrendous. I also just like the idea of not having to depend on software or having to download anything for it. You just do it on the keyboard itself. Bam! You can set it to different levels or a bunch of patterns such as stars, bars, breathing, ripple, which works like that, some kind of random thing, although the keyboard doesn't appear to type in this mode, static, light wave, and various ones that light up as you type. You can develop your own patterns, but of course this does actually require an external program, as well as knowledge of C++ or something. The lighting looks okay, but I find white somewhat boring. Apart from that numpad thing I talked about, I consider backlighting to be completely useless, and if it doesn't even look kinda cool, I don't really see the point, to be honest. I mean, it doesn't have to be RGB or something, but I think having the basic 7 colors would make it look better, and it would also actually be useful in this case to highlight the arrow keys and the nav buttons in different colors. They do an RGB version of this keyboard, but then you have to pay another $40 just for that, and I think that's overkill. Other features include a gaming lock, a 1000 Hz polling rate, selectable repeat rates, and 6-key rollover and N-key rollover. Yeah, that one caught me a bit off guard as well at first, but basically it's normally in 6-key rollover mode, and it switches to N-key rollover if you press more than 6 keys. So it's basically N-key rollover, but this little juggle is done for compatibility and hardware limitation reasons. It's a bit elaborate, but whatever, it's got N-key rollover, fine. At the back, we see 2 more features, which are also quite old school, a cable gutter and a detachable cable. Cable gutters are really useful, and I don't see why most other keyboards from nowadays don't have one. It can't exactly be expensive to make this or anything. The detachable cable is a bit hit and miss though, because yes, it's useful for when storing or moving the keyboard, but unlike some old school connectors, like the detachable Model M cable, which locks into place, preventing it from slipping out, this one doesn't do that, and if you yank it hard enough and you use the cable gutter in the middle, which is a bit short, it doesn't hold it tight enough to prevent it from slipping out. The good thing is that the cable is a simple micro USB to normal USB cable though, so you can easily replace it if you break it or lose it. Finally, it supports macros, but I found this to be by far the weakest aspect of the board. Macros are very useful both for gaming and for general use, and I even bought Numpad that only does macro keys, which I showed in an earlier video. Like with the lighting, this doesn't require an external program to do, but it also doesn't work, which is bad, despite apparently having a powerful processor to do it. First of all, the downloadable manual is utterly useless in describing how it works. There's no instructions on how to do it at all. Thankfully, CM sent me a document which does, although it gives 2 different instructions on how to do it in the same document, and neither of them work. When I first got it, it worked fine, but just yesterday night when I thought I'd try it out again, I found that it kind of jammed, and now it no longer works even after repeated unpluggings. What you're supposed to do is press Fn plus F11, which I think should turn the lights on most of the keys off, but it doesn't. Then you press a key to record it on, which should make it flash, which it won't, and then you input your string, followed either by a selection of single use, repeat, or infinite loop, or not, depending on which instructions you follow, and then Fn plus escape to reset it, and then it should turn the lights back on. Alas, as you can tell, none of that actually works, and moreover, when it did still work, I noticed that macros are executed in real time rather than as fast as possible, which isn't always what you want it to do. So something obviously went badly wrong with the macro feature on this particular board, and I'd advise Cooler Master to check that out because it's pretty silly. Almost everything else, including the construction, the keycaps, the $110 price tag, and even the rather plain looks, are pretty standard for premium gaming keyboards nowadays. Not better or worse, just basically the same. As with other modern gaming keyboards I own, it's made out of a lot of tightly held plastic and a metal mounting plate, so it's built fairly well, and it's impossible to open because some of the screws are hidden. I see this happen all the time nowadays, and I really wish all these companies would just stop putting in this stupid anti-feature where you can't even disassemble your own keyboard, because I don't see how they benefit from this, and I know the customers certainly don't. The bottom of the keyboard reveals the model sticker, which shows what I think is an internal part number and the manufacture date in April of 2016. And there are 4 broad, non-slip pads and rubber-shod Keytronic-style flip-out feet. The rubber on the feet really helps to keep it in place, and indeed this board is very stable on your desk. The metal mounting plate is actually painted white to help reflect more light back at you, but a disadvantage that might not occur to you if you haven't tried it out is that food bits and hair, referred to as board chow, stand out a lot more. So unless you're very careful, you might have to clean it every now and then or face the grossness. The keycaps are also very standard for backlit keyboards nowadays. They're painted and then laser ablated semi-transparent ABS. They're kind of medium thick and not that bad really, but the problem with this kind of keycap is that the lettering can start to wear off after extended use. And they almost invariably come with practically no texture, which makes fingerprints really stand out on them. What I like about them though is that they use a normal font rather than the showy crap on most other gaming keyboards out there. Yeah, I know I keep bringing this up, but those are just really ugly and hard to read, I think. And then finally, the switches. You can order it with Cherry MX Red, Brown or Blue, but they had a bunch of MX Greens lying around, and as I didn't have an MX Green board yet, they offered me one with them in instead. Which is cool because I've had a lot of requests for an MX Green board review. MX Green is a clicky switch, and it's the stiffer version of MX Blue. MX Blues have a tactile force of just 60 grams of force, making them one of the lightest clicky switch types around. Greens are much stiffer at 80 grams of force, and are normally used as spacebar switches in MX Blue boards, but some boards are offered as all green for those with hammers for hands. 80 grams of force is kinda Space Invaders territory, which can be really tiring if you're not used to it. I myself count 80 grams of force to be at the absolute maximum for clicky switches I can tolerate. I mean, I can do it, but I'm a bit more comfortable around the 65 gram zone personally. Particularly heavy-handed users often really like these switches though. Now, of course, people really want to know how these compare to MX Blues with regards to feel, and unfortunately I don't have plate-mounted MX Blues from this year, only there's PCB-mounted G80 from 2001 to show it against. Some people say greens are a bit more tactile, but I honestly can't feel a significant difference. Whether you press them slowly or actually type on them, they both still only feel just off-linear, I think. Of course, because greens are so much stiffer than blues, the bottoming out feel is a bit different. Blues bottom out harder, and therefore this presents a much more noticeable event than it does on greens. I do have boards with Gatorons and Kales in from 2016, and although they feel a little bit different, maybe it's not that significantly different, I'd say. It's still the same kind of feel overall. For me, greens are not different enough from blues to truly win me over, really. If I had to pick a stiff, clicky switch, I'd still rather stick to clicky Space Invaders, which also happen to sound better. The sound of MX Greens doesn't appear to be quite the same as that of MX Blues, although because of the difference in chassis between this and that, it's quite hard to directly compare the two. When not bottoming out and only triggering the clicker, which limits this effect a little bit, MX Greens do sound harsher and more high-pitched though, I think. I'll show you. So, all in all, I'd say it's extremely standard in most regards, from the looks, the keycaps, the price, the features, the construction, the choice of switches, etc. Mostly, it's a very run-of-the-mill keyboard. In these respects, it's not better, nor is it worse than the competition. You're not missing out, and you're not getting more. The thing that sets it apart for me is how they dared to readopt the navless layout and how they made it even better, and just how well it works in that regard. I much prefer this to a TKL personally. I do think that for the next iteration they should consider putting in more color options to help with the numpad toggling, and they might want to check out the thing that happened with the macros, but otherwise I think it's a pretty nice keyboard, and people who use their boards for numbers work as well as for gaming, but who don't want the full size, might find this very much to their liking. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.